Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to sqadia.com. My name is Mohammad Osama, and today we are talking about introduction to the nervous system. In this specific lecture of this series of lecture, we're going to talk about the central nervous system, specifically the spinal cord. So in the previous lectures, we did the classification of the central nervous system, and we said there are two major parts of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord and the brain. We have discussed the brain in the previous lecture, in which we talked about the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. And this lecture we are specifically going to talk about the central nervous system, specifically in terms of spinal cord. So let's start off with what is the spinal cord. So spinal cord is a roughly cylindrical area or roughly cylindrical structure which begins superiorly at the foramen magnum and is continuous with the medulla oblongata of the brain, and it is a major part of the central nervous system of the human body. Or on the other hand, it terminates inferiorly in the lumbar region, specifically if you are talking about. So it terminates at the level of the first lumbar vertebra, give or take. So it starts off from the medulla oblongata at the level of the foramen magnum in the skull, and it terminates at around the level of L1 lumbar vertebra. So below the spinal cord, below the termination of the spinal cord at the L1, the spinal cord tapers off into conus medullaris, from the apex of which there is a prolongation of the pia mater, which is known as the filum terminale, and it descends to attach to the back of the coccyx. So here if we look at this picture, so this is the vertebral column, and in this vertebral column we can see that this is the spinal cord. Now this is the L1 vertebra. So at the level of the L1 we can see that the spinal cord has terminated and it tapers off in the form of conus medullaris. Now, after the spinal cord has terminated, the spinal nerves which haven't exit the vertebral column yet, they travel down below to their appropriate segment where they would exit the spinal column. So here you can see that as well, and that collection of those spinal nerves beneath the termination of the spinal cord is known as cauda equina. Now, on the other hand, after the termination of the spinal cord, the pia mater tapers off as well, and it forms a continuation and it goes and attached to the posterior aspect of the coccyx, and this actually is known as the filum terminale. So there is a difference between these three terms: conus medullaris, tapering off the spinal cord; cauda equina, collection of the spinal nerves beneath the termination of the spinal cord; and filum terminale, the extension of the pia mater after the termination of the spinal cord. So these are three different things which are usually confused by students. Now, along the entire length of the spinal cord are attached 31 pair of spinal nerves by the anterior or motor roots on the posterior or sensory roots. So we have a total of 31 pair of spinal nerves, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Important thing to remember is that there are 7 cervical vertebrae but 8 cervical spinal nerves. Each root is attached to the cord by a series of rootlets. So it's not just like a wire, it is actually a lot of rootlets which are actually originating, and those rootlets combine to make one spinal nerve. So each root is attached to the cord by a series of numerous rootlets which extend the whole length of the corresponding segment of the cord. And each posterior nerve root possesses a posterior root ganglion, the cells of which gives rise to peripheral and central nerve fibers. On the other hand, the anterior nerve root or the anterior motor neuron is actually the cell body is present inside the spinal cord, so there is no anterior root ganglion. So here you can see the cell body for the anterior motor neuron is present inside the anterior horn or the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So there is no ventral root ganglion, it is just the cell body is located here. So from here the motor neuron originates and passes through the ventral root. On the other hand, the sensory fibers which are coming from the periphery or the receptors, they come here, and here we have actually uh, uh, sensory ganglions, which is also known as dorsal root ganglion, where the cell bodies for these sensory nerve fibers are present, and they then move to the dorsal root or the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, there is no cell body, because the cell body is located outside the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion. So that is one thing to be remembered here. And as we already discussed, the question that arises here is that if the spinal cord terminates at the level of L1, how do we have L2 spinal nerve, L3 spinal nerve, L4 spinal nerve, and so on? It is very important to understand that L1 spinal nerve or L2 spinal nerve does not correspond or does not mean the L2 vertebra. So the vertebral segments are different. The segment or the spinal segment of L1 may be present somewhere else. It would not be present in the region of the L1 vertebral level. So that is a very important fact to understand, first of all. Secondly, how L3, L4, L5, and so on, these spinal nerve roots are actually formed, or these spinal nerves are formed. So what happens is that once the spinal cord terminates at the level of L1 and by forming the conus medullaris, the nerve fibers or the spinal nerves that have originated from the spinal cord, they keep on traveling into the vertebral column, and those spinal nerves, depending on the site where they exit from, they are given the name of that segment. Now, how is the name given to different spinal nerves? How can I say that this is the L1 spinal nerve, this is C7 spinal nerve, and so on? So there is a difference in the nomenclature for different sections. Cervical has a different nomenclature, and the thoracic, lumbar, and so on has a different nomenclature. Because if you look at the cervical spine, we have 7 vertebral segments, C1 to C7. But if we look at the cervical spinal nerves, we have C8. So we have 8 cervical spinal nerves. So if I say that the C1 spinal nerve, so C1 spinal nerve originates above the C1 vertebral level. C2 spinal nerve originates above the C2 vertebral level. And similarly, C7 spinal nerve originates above the C7 vertebral level. And C8 spinal nerve originates beneath or below the C7 vertebral level. Now, the C8 has originated below the C7, so it means that T1 cannot originate above the T1. So, after cervical, when we start off with the thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, and so on, so now the nomenclature is of the sort that if I say T1, so T1 spinal nerve originates beneath the T1, so it means between T1 and T2. T2 spinal nerve will originate beneath the T2 vertebral segment and between the T2 and T3 segment. Similarly, the L5 spinal nerve will exit between the L5 and S1, not above the L5. So that is an important thing to understand. Moreover, if we look here, so we can say that in the cervical vertebra, and for example, if the thoracic, if we talk about the 10th thoracic vertebra, so in the region of the 10th thoracic vertebra, we have L1 to L2 cord segments. So L1 and L2 cord segment are not at the level of L1 thoracic vertebra. So this is an important thing to understand, the relationship of the spinal cord segments with the corresponding vertebral segments. So it needs to be kept in mind because it is very important clinically as well. Moreover, the spinal cord is composed of an inner core of gray matter which is surrounded by an outer covering of white matter, which is in opposition to the brain, in which the white matter was inside and the gray matter was outside. The gray matter is seen on cross section as an H-shaped pillar. You can see it's like an H with anterior and posterior gray columns or horns, united anterior and posterior gray columns, or you can also call ventral and dorsal gray columns, united by a thin gray commissure which is this. This is the thin gray commissure. The white matter, for purposes of description, may be divided into anterior column, lateral column, and posterior column, and different type of ascending and descending tracts pass from these columns. For example, anterior spinothalamic tract is present in the anterior column. The lateral spinothalamic tract is present in the lateral column, and the dorsal column medial lemniscus system is present in the dorsal column or the posterior column. One important thing, if we look at this picture, is regarding the rootlets. As we already discussed, that the spinal nerves originate from numerous rootlets which actually correspond to the same spinal cord level. For example, L4. So this is the L4. So these all rootlets are actually corresponding to the L4 segment of the spinal cord. There's also an anterior median fissure if you look at the cross section, and also the posterior median sulcus in the spinal cord. And here we can see this is the dorsal root ganglion, which has the sensory cell bodies, and there is no ganglion in the ventral root, and this is where anterior motor neuron is present. Now, very important, the tracts which are present in the spinal cord. So there are two types of tracts, which are the ascending tracts and there are the descending tracts. Now, there are numerous types of tracts, but we would only look into the general overview of how the ascending and descending tracts work. So ascending tracts are the tracts which take the information from the periphery or the stimuli, and they take the information to the higher centers of the brain and spinal cord. So let's take this example. So here we have a sensory ending, and then there is a sensory neuron which is taking the message from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord, and the cell body of this neuron is in the dorsal root ganglion. Now this is the first neuron in this series of neurons, so it is called as the first order neuron. Now this first order neuron then synapses in the spinal cord with the second order neuron, which crosses to the other side of the spinal cord and travels upwards and terminates, for example, in the thalamus. For example, the ventral-posterior medial nucleus or ventral-posterior lateral nucleus, or any nucleus of the thalamus. So this second order neuron, which originated from the spinal cord, has terminated in the thalamus. So this is the second order. Now this synapse with the third order neuron, which starts from the thalamus and it ends in the somatosensory area or primary somatosensory area, where the stimulus is perceived. Now this is an example of ascending track or ascending pathway consisting of first order, second order, and third order neuron. On the other hand, we have the descending track in which the message from the brain is originated in the higher centers of the brain, and it is transmitted via the descending tracts to different type of effector organs such as muscles, for example. So from here we see that there is actually the gray matter or the primary motor cortex, from where the message is generated via the first order neuron. This first order neuron passes through the brain, different levels of the brain, from the forebrain, then midbrain, and the hindbrain, and it decussates, for example, at the level of the medulla oblongata or at the level of the spinal cord, and goes to the opposite side, and then it terminates at the interneuron in the spinal cord. Then that interneuron synapse with the alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord, and then alpha motor neuron takes the message to the muscle. So that interneuron was the second order neuron, and that muscle was the third order neuron. So in numerous cases there is no interneuron present in the descending tract. So in that case, we, instead of using the nomenclature of first order, second order, and third order neuron, we can just use the nomenclature of upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. So the one that originated from the cerebral cortex, for example, was the upper motor neuron, and it terminated on the alpha motor neuron of the spinal cord, which was the lower motor neuron. And that also gives us the term, a clinical term, of upper motor neuron lesion and the lower motor neuron lesion whenever there is an injury or any dysfunction in these different neurons, giving us different type of clinical manifestations. So that was all about the central nervous system and spinal cord, and we should talk about the structure of the spinal cord, the cross-section area of the spinal cord, and the ascending and descending tracts of the spinal cord. I hope you learned something new out of it, and stay tuned for watching more lectures like this on sqadia.com. Thank you for watching.